And what he created, and he did create, I mean, there's one thing that human beings can create in this world, okay? As the economist J.B. Say pointed out in 1802, human beings cannot create goods, okay? They can transform elements of their environment so that they better satisfy wants, but they can't create something from nothing. However, ideas are something that human beings can create. They are something new under the sun. And that was the case with Carl Menger. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about what economics looked like when Carl Menger began to write, or when Carl Menger published his book. He began to write it a little bit earlier than 1871. There were the classical economists. Now, the classical economists, Ludwig von Mises liked the classical economists. They did a lot of good things. But they did have their flaws. But so David Hume, Adam Smith, David Ricardo, they were the main classical economists. You might want to add in John Stuart Mill, who wrote later in the century, but he was a much weaker thinker than these three. Okay, and he turned towards socialism under the influence of his wife, Harriet. Okay, let me just say a few things about the classical school. They faced a problem that they could not solve. What they did was that they focused on goods, okay, when they dealt with goods, as classes, so that they talked about diamonds, water, coal, bread, okay, in general, not as they related to human beings at a given time in history with given wants and given resources at their disposal, okay, which is what Menger did. So that brought them face to face with a problem. And that problem was the paradox of value. And they went wrong in trying to solve this paradox. Because they gave this paradox a wrong answer, their value theory was flawed. And this is what ultimately undermined the classical school. So they looked at diamonds and they said, there's a paradox there. Diamonds are very expensive, okay? On a carat of diamonds cost much more, or had a much higher price than let's say, a pound of bread. But on the other hand, bread was much more useful to human beings, okay? Without bread, and again, I'm thinking in classes, if there's no bread in the world, okay, whoever chooses between all the bread in the world. I mean, this is Menger's great insight. No one does. But without bread, human beings would not be able to subsist, because that was a staple in England, bread. On the other hand, diamonds were, simply a mere frippery. They were for ostentation, for conspicuous consumption. We could do without them and not be worse off as human beings. We could certainly go on living. So that was the paradox. Now, how did they solve that paradox? What they did was to, okay, and here's an example of the paradox, okay. That diamond, which is a graph pink, was at the time, in 2010, the most expensive diamond ever sold at auction. And you can begin to see the problem there, right? Because the classical school believed that the cost of production was what determined the price of a good. So this is how they tried to solve the paradox of value. They said, look, there's two kinds of values for goods. There's a subjective use value, the satisfaction that human beings get from consuming the good, and then there's an objective exchange value, which was the price of the good on the market. So what they said was, well, we don't really have much to say as economists about subjective use value. Yes, there has to be subjective use value if something is to be a good, but that's all we're going to say about it. So they just forgot about it. And they focused on building a system of economic theory around the exchange value, trying to explain prices of goods and services. And their explanation was a cost of production explanation. So Adam Smith used money costs of production. David Ricardo used an even simpler theory, which was picked up by Marx, and that is the number of labor hours. So if, for example, an HD TV had 20 times the number of labor hours as, let's say, a tablet computer, then the HD TV would be 20 times as expensive. Okay. But they confronted another problem. Okay. The problem was, okay, things like HD TVs, articles of clothing, coal, and so on, those all can be reproduced. And in some sense, you can explain the prices by the costs, okay, though those costs were backward-looking. On the other hand, what about something like this diamond? Okay, we don't know when it was found. No one knows what the cost of this diamond was. Or what about things like the handwritten lyrics to I Am the Walrus by John Lennon, which sold for over $100,000 at auction? How much did that cost John Lennon to write those lyrics? Or what about a painting by an old master who's now dead, or any artist that has passed away? The price of those paintings typically have nothing to do with the cost of production. Classical economists weren't dumb. They recognized this problem. They said, well, okay, there's two kinds of goods. So one kind are the reproducible goods, the clothing, the McDonald's hamburgers, and so on. These things have their prices explained by cost of production. Prices depend on the cost of production. Other things like antiques, collectibles, handwritten lyrics, and so on, those things are scarcity goods. So that's explained simply by supply and demand. Now, they did believe in supply and demand. This is one of the reasons why Menger liked them. In the short run, they did believe that the supply and demand for a good determines its value. So therefore, for example, that if the demand for hybrid cars goes up, then you have an increase in the price of those hybrid cars. And they went even further. They had a good theory of how prices regulate production. They did not think prices were arbitrary. So Menger also liked these two things about them. The fact that they did focus on supply and demand, at least in the short run, and at least for goods that could not be reproduced, and that that in the long run, what was my other point, which is now slipping away, that prices did regulate production. Okay, so that when, for example, take the example of an increase in the price of oil in 2010, when the price of oil shot up, the fracking technology became commercially viable. So in response to the increase in price, there was an increase in the supply or output of oil and gas. And resources then shifted into those areas. So they did believe that supply and demand control things in the short run. But in the long run, everything tended toward the cost of production. Since there were high prices, let's say in fracking technology, more people got into fracking technology. We had more oil. With the greater supply of oil, prices fell, and the price fell to near the average cost, which then wiped out profits. So this was the theory of the classical economists. Right? So there were a number of problems with that theory. So this is what I just went over. They were certainly wrong about this. Okay? That was their explanation. This is what I just mentioned about how prices regulate production. And you can, these will be up, and you can go through them. But any increase in demand for anything raises the price in the short run above the average cost. That brings about a profit, and that raises the profit above normal, brings new people in, draws new entrepreneurs in, and that pushes prices down. So when the Apple iPad was introduced, there was introduced at a high price, high profits, and soon the tablet computer market exploded. So all of this stuff was good, at least from Menger's point of view. But the paradox of value was the real problem. Now, before I get to Menger's purpose, it's important to point out that the classical economists believed that value was inherent in a good. Okay, so that when you had a price of a good, and its cost, that cost was determined by the production process, by what happened before the good reached the market, not by the consumers, not by the judgments of the consumers, but by the laborers, in some sense, sweating into the good. How much sweat was put into the good? That's the cost of the good. But as I pointed out before, certainly we don't know, or certainly from the point of view of an individual, if a diamond is picked up on a beach or a diamond, it takes a lot of effort to find and to mine. Those two diamonds, if in the eyes of the consumer to have the same quality, well, then those two diamonds are equal in value. Okay? So Menger's point was that value was forward-looking. Okay? Once the good came onto the market, you had individuals assessing those goods and how important they were for their own ends. So value was not inherent in a good. Value was imputed to a good by human beings who were deciding on how useful those goods were in achieving their own welfare. Okay, so in the preface of his book, Menger wrote the following. He said, "I have devoted special attention to the investigation," and note these, the words that I have in red here, "causal connections between economic phenomena involving products and the corresponding agents of production, not only for the purpose of establishing a price theory based on reality and placing all price phenomena together under one unified point of view, but also because of the important insights we thereby gain into many other economic processes, which were before then completely misunderstood." So he wanted to explain the value of all goods, not just consumer goods, but also labor, land, capital goods. He wanted to all explain it by one principle. Okay? So that was his intent. And you can see that what he did was to start a tradition, and we call it the causal realist tradition. He wanted to explain the cause of prices in the real world. So his price theory, Austrian price theory, is causal realist price theory. Okay? It's the investigation of the causes of real prices and wages that are actually paid on the market. We want to know what explains the prices that are right now being paid, for example, at Walmart. Okay? Why are those prices being paid? Okay. This is what Menger aimed at explaining, and all of his followers have kept to this tradition. It's very important. Now, in writing some notes to himself, okay, before he wrote his book, he came up with this idea that human beings were at the center of all economic activity. He was a journalist. He was a financial journalist. So he saw that prices were changing on financial markets, not only from day to day, but sometimes from minute to minute. And that certainly wasn't something that the classical economists could explain with their cost of production theory. So he began to make notes to himself. And one was, man himself is the beginning and the end of every economy. Okay, so the economy begins with people's wants, okay, and ends with people satisfying those wants through their economic activities. And I'll give you a little diagram of how that occurs. He also wrote, our science is the theory of human beings' ability to deal with their wants. So now what he's doing, he's putting consumers at the center of economic activity. The classical school, because they had sort of pushed aside subjective use value, put the business decision maker, the businessman, at the center of economic activity. Okay, so what the classical school focused on was buying your factors of production, your resources cheap, and producing a good that